Check, check. Good? There's a lot of people in this room. All right. Welcome to the Quadrax live stream. I have a bit of a cold, so apologize in advance. Might be some quick muting. Yeah, let's dive in. I know last time I started with a patch, but this time I just kind of wanted to start zoomed in. Yeah. So we have a new version, 1.1 is out today. It adds some new modes and then makes some of the curves a little more extreme. That's kind of the main thing. But I want to go through Quadrax kind of start to finish, basically following the manual. So I'm using the table of contents kind of as a guide. I'm going to mix it up a little bit though. So quick overview. Quadrax is the sequel to the Quadra, which was an envelope generator. Had 4 channels. Very similar layout to this. I had an exponential switch in the middle. Now we have a kind of curved pot, so you can adjust that. On the original, there was AR envelopes, ASR, and cycling envelopes. On the Quadrax, there is those same 3, plus a burst mode, which is basically an LFO encapsulated in a envelope. And there's a LFO mode with morphing shapes. The Quadrax also has a modulation matrix. So there's 4 CV inputs, and those can be assigned to any of the knobs plus level on any of the channels in any of the modes. And so you can self-patch a lot of stuff. Use one channel to modulate another, or modulate multiple channels, or modulate itself. We also have trigger normaling. So on the Quadra, you had to kind of patch a trigger into each jack to have that trigger the envelope, or use cycling, or you could use the expander to do it. But on this, we can just with a button click normal the triggers down, and so you can have one channel trigger another one, or one trigger input trigger multiple channels. And then we also have an expander called the QX, and that is basically 4 channels of 2 gate outputs. So end of rise and end of fall for each channel. In the envelope modes, it's end of rise, end of fall. In the burst mode and LFO mode, they're slightly tweaked, so you can get some kind of variations out of it. So new in version 1.1, each mode has an alternate mode. And I'll go into those in detail when we go through each mode. So the panel is pretty simple. There's the sync option strip, or the channel link buttons, and then there's the mode buttons, and then a rise and fall knob, and a shape knob for each channel. Yeah, let's dive in. I'm just going to patch this to channel 1. I just have a little scope here. Get rid of this charger cable. And then we're just going to trigger this. Actually, I might just use cycling mode to show the envelope shapes. So the envelopes mostly function the same. So if we put it in just regular mode and use a square wave to trigger this, we can end up with a very similar kind of shape, but there'll be a little bit of gap depending on the speed of the incoming clock. Okay, so these are turned pretty low. Let's see if we can get steady here. So I'm just going to use the cycling one as the demo and take out this patch. So here's our basic shapes. Try to make a match. So this is a linear envelope. And so if we move the shape, you can see we're getting more exponential on the uptake and on the rise and the fall. And so in the original version, it got probably to about here. In the new 1.1, it gets almost to a square wave in kind of extremes. And so if we toggle the other way, then we get the kind of flip shape of that. And then so the the rise gets like a sharper uptick in the later half and a little bit slower in the beginning. One thing to note is that this won't affect your envelope time. That's always determined by rise and fall. That's never modified by the shape. Yeah, so let's jump into the alternate mode for that. It's pretty simple. To toggle any of the alternate modes on any of the channels, you just hold the mode button here, and then it will start to flash. What this does in all three envelope modes, so in the first three options, AR, ASR, and cycling AR, it mirrors the rise curve on the fall slope. So if it's logarithmic on the rise, then it's going to be exponential on the fall, which gives you matching curves. And so you can get really like clicky envelopes with this. Should actually patch this into something. Let's take a Dixie, do VCA. Let's go very slow. Input. Oh, I'm muted. There we go. Getting Instagrammed here. Okay, so this is a very fast envelope. You can see by the LED in the middle. We could slow it down quite a bit. The scope's not going to pick that up, but yeah. So let's try to hear the difference between the shapes. So this is normal mode, and then as we morph, we end up with like, this is linear, so the ramp is the same going up and down, and then as we go this way, the fall gets like a little harsher curve. So it's linear, exponential, and now let's do mirrored. So now we end up with like a real like fat wave here, and then kind of a bell shape. They're a little mismatched because these have to be dialed in the same. And then you end up with a real like clicky vibe. One of the requests for the latest firmware, or a request when we had the original release, was kind of sharper envelopes. And so the mirrored mode doesn't really help with that, but the new curves help quite a bit with that. So if we turn that off, let's trigger this with a clock. This gives us quite a bit more. So the old ones probably would have limited you to about there. The new one, if you dial this back even more, it's quite a bit poppier. You can still get that ring out if you want, but you really dial it back. Of course, adding attack on any of these, like regardless of your settings, it's kind of you're gonna lose that pop. So really, attack at the bottom is where you're gonna find it. All right, so that's the basics of the envelopes. I can show you the ASR or so this is AR. It triggers if you have a long envelope. It fires and keeps going, and like regardless of if the gate stays high, it only fires on the edge of the gate. If we go to attack, hold, release, there's a sustain stage as long as the gate is high, and then it does the final release or the fall. And so if one of the differences in ASR and AR is if you release your gate before the attack stage is finished, it's actually going to go into the fall stage. And so you can see on the scope, make this really long. So when you hold this, we can hold it till it hits the top, and then when we let go, it does the fall stage. If we only go halfway up, it'll just do the fall stage from part way. And so you get a little more, you can get a little bit more expressive on the ASR mode, as opposed to the AR, where it's going to go all the way to the top before it does the fall stage, and there's not a way to stop that. On the decay stage, though, you can press it again, and that will re-trigger the envelope from where it is on the decay stage. So if we shorten this, you can kind of keep it high, and that works the same on all three modes. So if we do cycling, that also triggers, and you can kind of force that to jump. All right, so that's the same across all four channels. The alt modes are with the curve mirroring is the same on all three of those, and so and that setting is remembered per channel, per mode. So if we toggle the mirroring on for this channel, then that's going to stay there when we come back around to it. But this channel will have its own, so we can set it here. So if you like the curve mirroring, you can just turn it on for all your channels, and it'll be there when you come back to it. Okay, burst mode. So the original burst mode, yeah, we had some syncing. Had an idea. There was an idea behind the thinking, but it didn't always come out very musical. And so we have a new burst mode. And what it is, burst mode is basically try to trigger this regularly. Oops. It's LFO encapsulated inside a envelope. And so in the new mode, this is your repeats. And this is going to be a little bit hard to show on the because we have to do it at a real fast rate. And so we have to do like a real short envelope. And it's probably not going to pick it up very well. This might be the best we get for here. So you can see it kind of scroll by. So this is our repeats. In the middle is the shape and tilt of the envelope. So at the center, it's equal rise and fall, and then as you move to the edges, that changes to less rise, more fall. And as you get to the very extremes, that sine wave LFO that's encapsulated in there actually starts to turn to a square wave, and you end up with like a little bit more of a like edge to the vibe, or to the envelope. And so as you turn the rate, you can see the number of repeats in that envelope is changing. And so as we morph this, it morphs into a sine wave, and then it morphs into like 50% attack, 50% release, and then it starts to shift the other way where it ramps up and then turns into a square wave again at the extremes. So on both ends of it, there's kind of a square wave extreme. And then this changes the overall size of the envelope. And then one other option, and this is optional. So originally we had some phase sync issues where if you got a retrig and the envelope wasn't finished, we would reset the cycle of the LFO and then re-rise it, but you end up with a lot of kind of spikes in voltage where the attack would jump and then you get a spike in your sine wave, and it would be a little bit kind of, it would start to get a little bit noisy. This one ignores retrigs by default until the envelope is finished. So if you make it really long and you have a really fast clock rate going in, it's only going to retrig once the cycle's finished and then once it gets the next trigger pulse. And so as you decrease the fall, if you have a fast clock rate, it actually works like a clock divider. And you can see we're not changing the rate of the incoming clock, we're only changing the rate of the total envelope. And turn it out. So as we move this, now it's getting cut in half because it's ignoring every other trigger. If we go a little bit further, it's probably ignoring every third, or it's only going every third trigger, every fourth, fifth. And so what that gets you though is the phase of the LFO resets when the envelope goes high. And so it always starts at 0 every time it triggers. If you want more traditional options where you can retrig in the decay stage, there's a setting in the global menu which you can get to, or in the system menu, which you can get to on boot by holding level. And that stuff's all in the manual. There's a couple toggles in there. So as it stands, this will always kind of give you really smooth waveforms because you're never going to get that retrig. It's not going to retrig and like re-amplify that LFO in the middle of a cycle. The only way you can kind of get a pop is if you really CV this quite a bit, because that'll move the waveforms around a lot. So really sharp motions. Okay, so by default, this is a sine wave that morphs into square waves on the edges inside envelope. If we go to alternate mode for this, that gives us a tilting saw inside of a tilting saw. And so on this end, we have the envelope, which is the amplification, and then as you move the shape knob or CV the shape knob, both the envelope and the waveform inside start to tilt. So at the top, it's a triangle wave inside a triangle envelope. And then as we shift over, we end up with a ramp wave inside an envelope. One of the other things we changed since version 1 is the LFO inside is now just a free running LFO. Originally it was a division and slice of the length of the main envelope. We found this a lot more tunable since the knobs don't affect each other. You can change your envelope length and your repeat separately. This gets real snappy. Yeah, so that's burst mode now. A little bit different. Similar effect, but we found this to be a lot more musical. Modulating pitch, modulating amplitude, like, yeah, quite a bit more. And again, if you want the retrigs, if you're giving it irregular triggers, or you just want it to refire every time it gets a trigger, that's an option in the global settings, or the system mode. All right, LFO mode. I'm gonna rejig the scope here. Up. Okay. So on this, on LFO, this is your rate. It goes well into audio rate. We're still modulating Dixie here, but I can show you. I'll plug that in a little after. Yeah. So turning this changes your rate. If you put a clock signal in here, then it actually works like a phase lock loop, and it will track the tempo and resync your LFO. And then this now becomes a multiplier and divider. So then if you increase your clock rate, these jump up in equal multiplications. Okay, so let's get a decent waveform. The shape is a handful of predefined shapes assigned to the LFO. The fall becomes the morph control. And so if you don't want any morph shapes, the fall control at noon is kind of where you want to sit. So if you want a perfect sine wave, fall control at noon, this all the way back. If you want a perfect triangle wave, that's on the other side. And then this is your morph control. So this is going to start to affect each waveform differently. At the center, we have a tripulse, which you can get to square if you dial the fall over, or you can pull the square wave out of the end of rise, or end of fall, on the expander. And so what we get is a mix of controls. So the shape knob crossfades in between those three shapes, and the fall knob is a morph control, and each shape has its own morphing. And so it's actually kind of like, so the sine wave morphs and shrinks the positive half of the wave, and then goes and bends the bottom half of the wave. And so if we go to the tripulse, this one kind of changes the pulse width at the top and bottom, and then as you expand, it increases that until it gets to square wave. And then you can see the edges start to morph as you get away from those, because we're morphing into both the next shape and the morph position of the next shape. And so if we leave these where they're at, and we start to morph in the sine wave into this tripulse wave, we end up with like a stepped voltage until we get smooth again and get to sine. And then if we go part way and start to move the morph control, we're actually morphing we're morphing all of the shapes at once, but whatever is being crossfaded is what you're going to see or hear. And so if we start morphing that, we're both morphing the square wave and the sine wave. And so we're getting a real stepped until we actually get back to a triangle wave. And then if we morph the other way, kind of morph back into like a phase inverted version of the tripulse. And then if let's go the other way, so we'll go from the tripulse to the triangle. And so this starts to add teeth to all of the stages. And then if we start to morph from there, it gets a little more square, and then back to triangle or saw wave. And then on the end, the morph control is tilting saw, very similar to the burst mode. Yeah, so I think one of the key things to recognize there is if you just want the standard shapes, put your morph at noon, and you'll get morphing between those standard shapes. If you just want a slow sine wave, dial this back, put your morph at noon, and you'll get a sine wave. If you want that for a triangle wave, you can do the same on this side. And then, yeah, you can CV control all of this stuff, but you can find quite a few sweet spots. One of the other things we did is dial in the extremes of this a little bit to kind of avoid any real popping and clicking, kind of unwanted popping and clicking. So these sound quite a bit smoother, especially when you're modulating between the extremes. Yeah. All right. Could stare at this all day. Let's go into alternate mode. This is brand new. This is Camille's design. Camille was the main engineer on this project as far as software goes. Yeah. So let's dial this back. I'll put this and this down. So we hold this. This is what we're calling the LFV, low frequency vacillator. And vacillator is someone who can't make up their mind. You could also call this like a drunken walk. So what we get is, and I don't know how well the scope's going to pick this up. I guess we'll see. Yeah, not bad. What it is this controls rate just like it does on LFO, up to kind of like a noise source. And if you offset that, which is this? No, I don't have a CV sign. I'll leave that for now. Yeah, so this controls the rate, and what it's doing is it's generating a new value on every cycle. And so it's a random step based on the size of your fall knob. And so this is the middle becomes a filter and the fall becomes a step size. And so if you increase the step size maximum to full, that means it could be a random jump from where it's at. So say it's at 0 volts, it could go up 5 or down 5 either way. That's like, it's extreme. The middle knob is a filter or a slew on that, so you can smooth out those waveforms if you want a really smooth kind of random walk, which you can kind of see here. And so how this works is rise controls the rate, so that's how often you're going to generate a new value. You can also clock sync this just like you could with the LFO. Step size, so fall is your other main control. That's going to control how much it can drift. So if you lower that to a really low value, it's gonna stay pretty close to where it was in the previous cycle. It's only gonna move a little bit, and then it's gonna try to, as it gets closer to the edge, it has a higher chance of changing direction. And so yeah, we end up with these like drifting voltages, which you can hear with the sine wave here. And so now we're into the negative, but the VC is already closed. And so if we turn the step size down, the chance of it moving, like it just can't move in a huge jump. So it's going to drift. So if you're putting this through something like scales or a quantizer, you can get really cool like drifting patterns that don't have a huge variety, but like they can travel. It can step in tiny increments all the way from one extreme to the other, but it's not going to do so in a huge jump. And then as you increase that step size, the maximum size of how far it can jump starts to increase, and so you end up with a lot more chaotic source, which you can slow down if you drop the rate. The filter in the middle smooths out those peaks. And so I'm going to increase this. So you can kind of see everything is a little bit jaggy. If we start to increase the slew or the filter on that, those all start to get smoothed out, and then the real small changes will actually just kind of get eliminated and smoothed into like a continuous form. As you increase that all the way, you end up with like a real kind of slow drift, and you start to not see a lot of change, which could be desired. But as we decrease that, you can see, and then as we increase the step size, the filter and the step size are kind of fighting to see like what's going to push that waveform up. And then as we dial back the filter, you can actually just hear it. It sounds like a noise source. So actually, let's just patch that. This is what that sounds like, just straight out of the oscillator. And then as we increase the filter, it sounds like a filter. Until you get to kind of closed. You can also decrease the step size to get a little bit. You get a little bit less volume, but the actual waveform is a little less. So yeah, as far as like, if you want a super slow drifting source, voltage source, put up the slew a little bit, lower the rate, increase the step size. You'll just have this like crazy voltage source just going through. Yeah. So if there's channels of the Quadrax that you're not using for something specific, it's a great just like toggle that on, plug it into something. You'll just hear that variation throughout the track and kind of move it around. All right, that's LFO mode. This is going way faster than the TET, so that's great. Yeah, let's cover the channel link options. So for this, you're probably going to want to watch the LEDs on the Quadrax itself. The scope is going to be a bit less of a help here. Maybe just going to move that out of the way. Okay, so if these are all in just normal AR mode, I'm just going to plug it into the gate on the planar to trigger them. These light up whenever they get a gate and whenever the envelope fires. If we, so the link buttons link to the previous channel, and that's labeled on the panel. And so if we turn on this to red, then when the first channel gets a gate, the second channel will match that gate as if you malted the cable and patched it into trig 2. And so this is going to fire both these envelopes. And so they can both obviously be different settings, but they will trigger at the same time. This normaling works for any mode. So you can put this in burst mode and then chain this as well. And this trigger will now fire this burst as well as the other envelope. We can chain it all the way down and get another envelope. And so now you can do one trigger chained all the way down. If we turn off this one, we could put a second trigger, so you don't have to normal all of them together, obviously. So now we have I don't know if this is on the screen. There's a FSR 1U triggering the second set, and this is triggering the first set. Let's go back to one channel here. The second channel link option is green, and it's end of rise. So let's put rise up a little bit, so it takes a second. When this hits its peak, that's when the next channel is going to fire. And so this gets to the rise, this will flash, and then fire its envelope. And so end of rise, let's channel all these together. So now we hit this goes end of rise, that one fires, that one's end of rise, that one fires, and so on. And so depending on the length of rise, that's going to affect kind of how long that stuff chains through. One interesting option, and sometimes is a little bit hard to maintain, but it's definitely doable. If we turn on the channel link on all 4 channels to end of rise, you end up with like a feedback chain where without any triggers at all now, we are just like the end of rise on each one is triggering the next one. And so if we turn this down a little bit, we end up with this chain that just kind of keeps going. One thing you can do, if we toggle this to a different setting, it might break the chain. You can always just keep a gate patched in to kind of like kickstart it again. And then once it starts going, it'll keep that loop going. That can be really fun with generative stuff. Even if you fired a trigger in there every once in a while and it just kept the thing going. If you're modulating these parameters, that's when the chance of this breaking, or like this kind of normal circular behavior breaking, is higher. Yeah, with CV. Okay, so that's green. That's end of rise. Yellow is end of fall, and so that takes into account the whole envelope. So when the fall hits, that's when the next one goes. One thing you can do here is you could passive malt. So if you're only doing end of fall trigger normaling, you could passively malt all the outputs together, and you'll end up with like a 8-stage waveform. This also works if we have different shapes going in. So now we have a sustain on the first one. This is going to hold high, so we're obviously not hitting end of fall. And then when that releases and the fall stage finishes, then it's going to start chaining down. We also mix these, so like so channel 4 is going to trigger when channel 3 does, but channel 3 is going to trigger when channel 2 gets end of rise, and channel 2 is going to trigger when channel 1 finishes its full cycle. And so the bottom 2 fire at the same time. This one fires after the full cycle. If we change this to green, then end of rise, and then these will start to chain together. If you're going to do the passive malt thing, we would suggest it's going to start mixing signals unless you do the end of fall, because then you know the previous one's not firing anymore. And then we can end up with that kind of chained behavior again. Yep. Should put this back in. Sorry. But obviously here we're only hearing one envelope because we're only hearing the first one, but it's automatically cycling. Yeah, so that's the trigger normaling on envelopes. If you have the expander, the green and yellow, the end of rise and a fall kind of match the expander. So if you you can see end of fall is going to fire when it's sitting there, so that's the loop is done, it's not firing. End of rise is going to fire only in the fall stage because we're waiting for the rise. It's going to fire at the end of rise, so the slow rise here, and then fall is going to be quick, so let's shorten this a little bit. So the rise stage is going, end of rise is happening because fall is happening. And then when it gets back to the end of the cycle, end of fall is going to light up again. And so if you're watching the LEDs on here, you can understand kind of how that trigger normaling is passing down visually. Cycling works the same way. These end of rise and end of fall will fire at the same time. So when you're trigger normaling those, you'll end up with similar. And you can kind of see that stuff chain down. The Quadrax is awesome for triggering drums, generative stuff, just triggering, or self-patching back into other triggers, which you can do here. Maybe you want to join them with an or something like that to get a little more variation. Should talk about trigger normaling in the context of the other two modes. Okay, in burst mode, we're going to get end of rise every time a cycle finishes. And so it's basically on your repeats. And so, and then end of fall happens again at the end of the full envelope. So longer envelope. This controls, so on a normal envelope on the first three modes, this controls end of rise, end of fall, and it goes from, I think it's like 0.3 milliseconds to 20 seconds. That's the range we put on the knob. You can exceed that with CV if you assign positive CV to rise or fall. In the burst mode, it's kind of 20 seconds for both, for the full envelope. So this would be 20 seconds. This would determine how much of it is rise, how much of it is fall. So in the center, it's 10 rise, 10 fall. You can also change the repeats while the envelope is going. And so, and that's something like self-patching one of the LFOs into the CB assignment to that is like something, or the LFV, the vacillator, is something really cool there, because all of a sudden your repeats and stuff will shift. Okay, so that's the trigger normaling for that. So red again is pass through. So even if this is on burst, we're just passing through the triggers. And so that's going to trigger one, trigger the next one. If we do end of rise, which you can see is firing on each thing. So let's put this in a simple mode. End of rise is now, I'll shorten the rise time. You can see every time the LFO cycles, it's going to fire the next envelope. And so if we do this, so these are triggered to the normal trigger on this, which is triggered to the end of rise on the first channel. So these, all three of these are going to fire every time this repeats. If we normal this to end of fall, then that's going to, again, fire when the loop is done. And so this is going to finish and then fire the rest of them. These three are matched. LFO is similar. Let's take out the clock. And then we'll just get a sine wave here. Oh, we're in vacillator mode. There we go. rise and fall is firing end of rise on the LFO, end of fall on the LFO. It's pretty simple. These are basically inverted versions of each other. And so syncing to that is the same. So you can sync to the downslope or you can sync to the upslope. In vacillator mode, it's firing end of rise when the vacillator is moving in a negative direction. And so, yeah. So when the vacillator is falling, which it can fall multiple times, or multiple cycles in a downward motion before it goes back up. And so you kind of get a random trigger source from the QX based on that. And because it's not shifting every cycle like the LFO is just going to get a square wave out of that matches the rate of the LFO. But if you put it in the vacillator mode, you end up with much more of a random trigger source there. And those pass the same, so green and yellow pass the same down. And so, like, this is with no triggers. You can trigger all of your envelopes with an LFO if you just want to, like, yeah. Sweet. Okay. Channel link. Okay, let's cover the last thing, CV assignments. This is kind of like you would think the most daunting, but it's actually pretty simple. You can see the extra labels that are kind of knocked out of the little rounded rectangles. So on the first column, we have CV A to D. That corresponds to jacks. And then we have rise, fall, shape, and level. And so rise is these are destinations, and these are inputs. So rise is your rise knob, fall is your fall knob, shape is the shape knob, and level is essentially a VCA it functions like a VCA on that channel. So if you assign something to level, it's going to default to level to 0 unless it has CV interacting with it. So it's kind of like a knobless VCA, just like the one up here. So this is going to default. If there's nothing patched into CV on here, it's not going to pass through any audio until you give it some. So that's essentially how the level control works on the Quadrax as well. Yeah, so how do you assign? You hold the source, either channel or CV that you want to assign first. And so if we want to assign CVA on channel 1, the blue LED is the CV channel you're assigning, which you can toggle just by tapping. So now we would be assigning CVB to channel 1, CVC to channel 1, and then if we hold on a different channel like that, now we're assigning CVC to channel B. All of the destinations can receive CV from multiple CV inputs, and you can do that on any channel. And so you can assign one CV to every channel, every parameter if you want it to. There's not any limitations there. So let's go to channel 1, CVA. So it'll just be flashing. To get out of this mode, you would hold it again on the selected channel. So we're going to jump in there. The way you assign it is, let's get CV from the planar, because that's easy to understand. Go to X and Y. So X is into A, Y is into B, bipolar. We're going to assign, and you can attenuate these with the module. And so when you tap it, it'll turn red or green. That means CVA is assigned to rise. Full brightness means 100%. So 100% of the CV coming in is going to affect rise on the module here. And then because it's bipolar, it'd be 100% positive or 100% negative. You can cycle through the attenuation options by tapping it. And so it'll go from full, I think 80%, 60%. Oh, no, it's 4. So 100%, 75, 50, 25 off. So let's just do 100%. And then we're going to leave this in the center. And then we're going to get a trigger. What do we got? X. It's going too fast. So we're doing attack. So as we increase the CV on here, we're getting more. It's essentially like turning the knob up. And then if we dial it back, then we're going to get really quick attacks. So if we assign that to, maybe we can just go back here. And maybe fall is more interesting. So let's turn that off. If you hold the CV, you can have it invert its effect, like a attenuverter, like the duet or the triplet, or an attenuverter, kind of like on the plonk. So let's assign to fall instead, and then we'll hop out of here. So we're gonna drop rise, and then it's back on the screen. Okay, so rise is dropped. Decay, we're gonna lower that, but then now that CV is assigned to it, like that's gonna start modulating decay. So I'm just gonna work with some motions here. And then that of course is stacked on top of the knob setting. So if we dial back the knob a lot, then those modulations coming from the planar are not gonna affect it as much. And then because this doesn't affect time, only the rise and fall does. We can adjust shape and have it like more square or like more poppy or clicky. Without affecting the time. With this knob anyways. Okay, so now let's go back into the CV assign menu. Let's assign shape. We can do it negatively at a lower amount. So we'll do like 75% on, or 50% on the X. Oops, that's the same control. So CVB, channel A, shape, 50%. Get out of here. So now, moving the joystick up and down is going to change exponential logarithmic. Moving it left and right is going to change the fall length. Yeah, and that's how you set CV. So you can do that for all channels. You just hold on the channel you want, tap the CV input you want, and then set on whatever setting you want. I will show you level quick though. So we're on channel A. Let's do a self patch here. So we're gonna turn on level, and you're gonna hear the envelope drop out because now there's no CV assigned to it. Oh, there is because we assigned CVB to it. So let's do CVC level. Now we're going to patch out of 4 into C. So channel 4 is now going to control the level on the first channel. And so let's put that into some kind of cycling mode. Put it into the vacillator. So only the positive voltages are gonna raise it, but we can get a cool. If we put the filter up and the step size, once you get it in the positive range, you can kind of hold it there. but you can see the kind of volume of it. It's actually inverting the envelope, so you can get negative envelopes if you give it a negative voltage into level. You can invert the envelopes that way. And so as we move this, we're affecting the rise fall. The vacillator here is affecting the overall level of the signals. If you don't want to mess with the attenuation on the Quadrax itself, you can of course pre-attenuate with a duet or quadrat or something before you pop it in, or a VCA, and then you can modulate that. And yeah. I think that's about it. I might scroll quick through the chat and see if there's anything. There's quite a bit there. Sorry, say it louder. Yeah, they are. Okay, so the question was the new burst mode versus the old one. The old one morphed. Obviously, don't have it here. Let's go pull these out. The old one at its center point determined. I think it was a sine wave, and then it got more square or more. Saw wave kind of as it went, but it had flat points because it's unipolar, and so it was doing like a sine wave. It was going up and then dropping the bottom, and so you'd get a flat. 50% of the cycle was kind of flat, and so you'd end up with like boop, 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 and then it would kind of bounce down. The new one moves that whole waveform above into the positive, and so you actually get. Oops, not plugged in there anymore. Oh, because the level is assigned. Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm just going to jump a little bit. If you want to clear the CV assignments on a channel, just hold both buttons. The channel will flash and all the CV assignments will flash. If you want to clear all the CV assignments in the whole module, just hold the top left and the bottom right, and then all blue will flash, and that will reset the options there. So in the old one, moving the shape would both morph the LFO type in the burst mode and change the ramp. And so on this, if you moved it anywhere on the left half of the pot, it would be a ramp down, I believe. So it would start at full attack and then ramp down. And then this would determine the shape. And then on the other side, it would ramp up. And so the new one actually, it peaks in the middle, and then you control whether the slope is like this or like this. And so yeah, instead of getting just the two shapes of like left and right ramping, you can actually get like a tilting, so you can get a bit of an attack and more decay, or the flip of that, like a little bit of decay, but with an attack. Okay. Yeah, I can do some demos, or if Scott has other questions from the chat that need.
Somebody asked for a quad oscillator demo.
Yeah, we can do that. I only have a couple pitch sources. I'm gonna, yeah, let's just do a quick patch here. Okay, I think I'm gonna just try, let's just use Quadrax itself as the only source here. So let's put this into an LFO, which sound pretty great at audio rate. There we go. So sine wave, and then, so if we leave this, then we end up with like tri-state, and then triangle wave, and then tilting saw ramp. And then, so CVA, take a pitch out of here. So we're going to assign channel 1 CVA to rise. Let's check it on here. So now we're tracking volt per octave. Let's turn it off. So let's take the last channel and we're going to run it through scales in vacillator mode. And so we can slow this down. Can actually attenuate it a little bit. Keep the range in check. And then you can actually clock that. So now we're just kind of droning. Let's use the second channel as an envelope. And so we'll take the trigger out of scales. Just going to fire every time it gets a quantized pitch. Yeah. And then we're going to patch that into CVB. And then on channel A, we're going to assign CVB to level. And so now all the LFO modes track volt per octave. So even you'll be a little bit limited for kind of tonal variety, but if you want a really quick one-channel voice, you can use burst mode, crank rise into audio rate, and then you can use fall and shape to adjust your envelope. But you'll get audio rate, volt per octave channels there. And so now we have the vacillator driving the pitch. We can make that more extreme with this. It's a trick for a lot of you. So I'm running the output of the vacillator into a duet, and so this is controlling the attenuation of it. So we're shrinking that signal into a narrower range. B is actually now an offset, and because we're patching out of the second channel, we can use that to shift the octave of where things are going into scales. Okay, so let's turn down rise. Let's get out of this menu. And then we can do the mirrored mode here. Oops. And then if we want to increase the tempo, we just bump this up, and scales will change notes a little more often. And then we still got a channel here. So let's get the output of here. Let's cross modulate onto the first channel. So, and these are really simple modulations. You can start getting to changing rise, fall, like things like that. So actually let's tweak this fall time with the vacillator. And so we're gonna go here. The vacillator is already, I guess we'd be using a pitched, so let's malt that. So that's gonna drive our pitch, and then we're also gonna use, oops, bump that. we're going to use a second version of that on D. So we're going to do CVD to fall time on the first channel. What did I do here? Get lost. I think I have a bump cable here. Let's try all this again. Oh, there we go. Okay, back on it. So now the vacillator is also modulating the fall times. There we go. Recovered. Yeah, so we have still an extra channel. So let's change that to an LFO. And then we have that patch, channel 3, patched into CVC. Let's go to CVA. So we're going to take CVC. Let's modulate we'll do one in inverse, just a little bit. And so now we're getting, jump out of this menu. So channel 3 is modulating the shape and morph of the horizon of the first channel. Yeah, so single voice, 2 modules, and an attenuator. And you can use these to control quite a bit, actually. And then you can obviously like put these into audio rate. And then like on this channel, you could also assign any one of these 4 inputs to control the modulation of that as well. And so this I just kind of randomly assigned a handful of things. So CVC is actually controlling quite a bit of stuff, and now we can do so if we go to CA, you can assign other, you can mix you can mix with that volt per octave. You can add more CV sources to apply to that same thing. Yeah, with one Quadrax you can get, with the new burst mode, because you can just volt per octave each one, which you couldn't on the old version. You can actually just get 4 independent voices that take 4 triggers and 4 volt per octave sources. Instead of reverb in here. Yeah, I think that's about it, unless there's more questions. It's not clipping the CV because we're adding multiple CVs. We're like pushing it into extremes, and then the second channel, or the second LFO that's modulating the first is driving the rates into audio rate, and so we're ending up with some like kind of noisier modulation. Yeah, I think that's about it. That's Quadrax. It does quite a bit on its own, and it does a lot when you add it to other things. I don't think I missed too much. There is a system mode if you want to change the behavior of the burst mode. We also changed the default envelope output to be 10 volts. If you had an original one, it's going to be a default of 5. So if you never changed it, you can change that in the system mode as well. Yeah, other than that, I think that's about it. If there's any questions, you can ask us on our forum. Hopefully the other guys here answered your questions in the chat. And yeah, I think we're done. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.